Welcome to Lesson 12D, Bulk Materials. We're going to talk about bulk materials. Most of this has to do with outdoor air pollution, but sometimes when you're filling tanks and stuff, it does have indoor air quality issues. We're going to talk about bulk material loading and various other activities and some ways to control or suppress the dust that's produced by it. Definition here, bulk materials is ground or crushed solids, powders, granular materials, anything that generates dust when handled. And here's some examples: tank filling, conveyor belt, stockpiling. We call this fugitive emissions, which are emissions from vaguely defined locations, as opposed to if you have a smokestack and you have emissions coming from that. That's a well-defined point source. We talk about this in ME 433 in detail. But if you have some kind of a tank filling operation or something, you may get dust coming out of vaguely defined places, not just one point. I want to start by looking at tank filling. And if you recall, we had a previous lesson about filling tanks with liquids. If you have some liquid coming in to a tank like this, you have liquid building up, and as the surface moves up, it acts like a piston and pushes the air as well as the contaminant out. The exact thing happens with solids. Suppose you have some solids coming in, grain, coal. It builds up a pile of this granular material, this bulk material we call it. And as you keep adding more and more, you're generating dust. And that acts like a piston. And then again, it sends it out as fugitive emissions. So you can actually see it then. It'll be not just a vapor, but you'll see that coming out. If you have a cylindrical round tank, they usually have two openings, and that's because if you're filling the bulk material here, it's again building up this granular bulk material, and it has to force the air and the dust out due to the displacement effect, just like we had with liquids. So the volume flow rate that you put in is the same volume flow rate of the air coming out. And then here's a picture of exactly this, and if you look closely, you can see this tube here. That is the inlet tube, so we're putting it in, filling it just like my sketch. And then there's a hole here, and you see the air that was inside the tank coming out, and that's called fugitive emissions. And so you're putting dust in the air, and there are rules about how much dust you can have, etc. I want to give you just a quick visual overview of some of these bulk material handling situations and fugitive emissions. You can have these on conveyor belts. If you're ever driving along the road and you see a cement plant or something like that, and they have these conveyor belts, there's lots of vibration, and as this thing's moving around, there's going to be a lot of dust generated. Another example is stockpiling. That's when you're taking granular material, this looks like coal, and you have the coal coming off a conveyor belt into a pile, and then you can see what we call fugitive emissions.
I see a similar thing when I pour cocoa powder into my cup.
Thanks, Mr. Nerdly. That's another good example. Another example is road dust. This occurs when you drive, especially on dusty roads and especially on dirt roads. But even on regular roads, you'll see some fugitive emissions. What we're interested in is how do you control these fugitive emissions? The best way is to spray water. And this can be done in various ways. Here's a picture that I took. This is, I believe, when they were building the Arboretum. I saw this tank truck that's spraying water out over the dirt to keep the dust down. The idea is you don't want to make it all a muddy mess, but you just want to spray enough that you can kind of settle down the dust. Another way is to have this ring. Here's a close-up. It looks like a basketball ring here where they're doing conveyor belt and stockpiling, and this is a very big drop here, obviously, but they have a ring right around the whole chute that's coming down of the bulk material, and they have these individual nozzles where water is just being sprayed. Again, enough of it to suppress the dust, but not too much that you make a muddy mess by the time it falls here. You want this to stay fairly dry. Here's another example of spray from a cylinder with a spray nozzle on that. So again, you're spraying water to suppress the dust from stockpiling. Here's a case where you have a conveyor belt and they're just spraying water on it to keep the dust down. Another way is to add a cover over top, and here's some various examples. You have a conveyor belt, and we put this rounded roof kind of thing over it just to keep the dust from getting into the atmosphere. Here's another tarp thing instead of metal. That's a little bit cheaper. Here's an example where you put a roof over a stockpile. You can see that in this particular case, the materials being come up here, that looks like that's covered as well, that conveyor belt, and then it goes down to the stockpile, and they just put this lid or roof over it. And finally, another way to do this is to design a better hopper. You have some kind of a blower that takes the bulk material and then lets it fall down. You get lots of fugitive emissions here. So this vendor says we made this fancy looking funnel where you can put the stuff in and it would help this to go more straight. And you can see, compare the two, that there's much less fugitive emissions. Here's another picture of putting stuff into a truck and you get all kind of fugitive emissions here. And then when they put it through this fancy funnel, it eliminates that. Inside they have a cone, an inverted cone, and it is designed to kind of channel the bulk material into a very narrow opening, and they're showing that you can't have it at an angle or it won't work right. This is similar to the surging we were talking about. They're doing little chunks at a time, and as long as the period isn't so bad, it'll work. And they show that you can go pretty long distances without fugitive emissions. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel for more videos.
1, 2, 3.